Is slavery right? And should it be legal? This question was asked countless times in the first half of the 19th century, when because of slavery and the emergence of the cotton gin, the cotton industry was booming. Northerners and Southerners continually clashed. Every time a new piece of land was acquired for the nation, the question of whether slavery would exist there or not always arose. It began in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise. In 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte sold the territory of Louisiana, to the Jefferson administration, doubling the previous size of the United States. The southern population, whose economy was booming thanks to the new cotton gin, was eager to expand their marvelously money-making peculiar institution into the territory. Southerners flocked to the huge new land, especially to Missouri, in enormous numbers. In only a little over 10 years, the land of Missouri had the 65,000 people it needed to become a state, and it wanted to come in as a state with slavery, a slave state. However, this would upset the careful balance of slave states and free states in the Senate. Politician Henry Clay, who's often called the Silver-Tongued Kentuckian, proposed a solution.
The compromise is Missouri will come in as a slave state, and then the next year Maine came in as a free state. They drew a line on the bottom of the state of Missouri. It was a 3630 north line, and that line ran west across the Louisiana Territory, the rest of the Louisiana Territory. Anything above that line was free, right? And anything below that line in the Louisiana Territory could come in as a slave state.
It was the hope of the nation that this would solve the problem of slavery's expansion. And it did, but only for now. Americans who had settled in Texas with their slaves declared their sovereignty when Mexico began cracking down on the slaveholders. After spending 9 years as an independent republic, the U.S. annexed Texas, and so the Mexican-American War began. Mexico had never recognized the Republic of Texas and declared that American annexation would be viewed as an act of war. Both sides fought long and hard for 3 years over control of the land. The United States emerged victorious, and Mexico was forced to sell an enormous amount of land to America. People started settling in the newly acquired territories, and when gold was discovered, a frenzy began. In an extremely short amount of time, California had far more than the minimum population required to become a state. However, that persistent question once again reared its ugly head. Would it be slave or free? President Taylor wanted to extend the Missouri Compromise line all the way to the Pacific Ocean, while Senator Stephen Douglas and Representative Lewis Cass advocated popular sovereignty, meaning that the people of the territory decided whether it would be slave or free. Some, like David Wilmot, even declared that the entire territory should be totally free, a radical notion at the time, while people like John C. Calhoun asked that the southern slave-holding states be permitted to secede from the Union. No one could come to a decision. Finally, Henry Clay, the great compromiser, once again brought a ceasefire. California would come in as a free state, while the rest of the Mexican cession would be divided into 2 different territories, Utah and New Mexico. The question of slavery there, which would doubtless arise eventually, was to be solved with popular sovereignty, according to the compromise. It also included a more enforced fugitive slave law, in which all southern people who claimed their slaves had escaped could retrieve them from the north. This made it far more difficult for people like Harriet Tubman and the other conductors of the Underground Railroad, for now those escaped slaves they had helped liberate were being brought back down south in great numbers. From the beginning of his election to Congress, Stephen Douglas believed in the idea of creating a legendary railroad to the Pacific Ocean from Chicago, in the north. However, the southern politicians in Congress did not support this plan, for they wanted a railroad that ran through New Orleans, in the south. In order to receive the votes of the southern senators and representatives in Congress, Douglas proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in January of 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was an act that divided the rest of the Louisiana Purchase into 2 territories, Kansas and Nebraska. The Kansas-Nebraska Act also proposed a new idea of popular sovereignty. Acting against the Missouri Compromise, which stated that all territories above the Missouri Compromise line were to be free. This caused an infuriated group of anti-slavery Northerners to band together and form the Free Soil Party. Even after the strike and protest that many Free Soilers presented, Congress still passed the act. After the act was passed, pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups hurried to Kansas. Elections for the Kansas Territorial Legislature took place in March of 1855. The anti-slavery voters had a majority. However, because of all the different groups in one area, arguments took place, often concluding in violence, creating a scene so bloody in the heart of North America that it came to be called Bleeding Kansas. The election of 1860 may have been one of the most crucial elections of all time, considering that the future of slavery was at stake. The Democratic Party could not agree on the issue of slavery and had split into two northern and southern groups, while a new party emerged, the Anti-Slavery Republican Party, which was made up of former Free Soil Party members and Democrats from the North. The four candidates running were John Bell, a member of the Constitutional Union Party, John C. Breckinridge, a Southern Democrat, Stephen Douglas, a Northern Democrat, and Abraham Lincoln, a Republican who was against the spread of slavery.
If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if it could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. Abraham Lincoln, 1862.
During the running, it became obvious that Lincoln satisfied more citizens than his three competitors. This made sense, for Lincoln played something of a neutral card when it came to slavery. He was against the spread of slavery, but promised not to abolish it in places where it already existed. It became clearer and clearer to the general public that Lincoln was going to win the election. In the end, Douglas, Breckinridge, and Bell's attempts to reach the presidency failed. Lincoln won the election with 180 electoral votes, a wide margin. Many Southerners were furious with these results, for Lincoln had not even appeared on the ballot in many Southern states. Several of those slave-holding states began to consider seceding from the Union. Lincoln's idea that slavery would not expand and eventually die out scared and infuriated many Southerners, for they did not trust Lincoln. Most Southern states considered leaving the Union, but the radicals in South Carolina were the first to take the initiative to depart. So on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina formally seceded from the Union. In order to preserve the Union, Senator John J. Crittenden proposed a group of amendments to help keep South Carolina in the nation. Since these amendments were aimed to preserve slavery, however, Lincoln had no choice but to reject them. And so in the course of the next 6 months, Texas, Alabama, Louisiana, Florida, Mississippi, Arkansas, North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, and Tennessee joined South Carolina to form the Confederate States of America. Overall, the debate and diplomacy between the North and South ultimately failed. It only prolonged the time before the inevitable conflict would explode between the two regions, like a bandage on a wound that will not heal. The country could not hold together with man enslaved. Every single compromise throughout all these years proved this fact. If America wanted to expand, the North would always demand more free territory, and the South would forever demand more slave territory. War would ensue, no matter what. It eventually became a question, of not if, but when. And the when came, on April 12, 1861, when the Federal Union outpost of Fort Sumter in Charleston Bay was shelled by Confederate cannons. The new president, however, was not simply going to let this go. He would not let the nation fall apart without a fight. He called for 75,000 Northern men to invade the South, and the Civil War began.